Imagine a world where death isn't feared but embraced as the ultimate path to divinity. A place where human flesh, slowly starved and preserved, is transformed into a sacred relic, embodying the very essence of eternal life. This isn't a myth or a legend, but the reality of the self-mummified monks of ancient Asia. For centuries, these monks, driven by a twisted devotion to transcendence, chose to enter a realm between life and death, enduring unimaginable suffering for the sake of spiritual purity. They didn't just give their lives for their faith. They gave their bodies, willingly and without hesitation, turning their skin, their bones, and their organs into holy artifacts of sanctity. What compelled them to seek immortality through such extreme, grotesque means? Was this act of self-sacrifice a way to reach nirvana? Or was it a darker, more horrifying obsession with the afterlife? In this tale of devotion and madness, we will uncover the chilling truth behind these self-mummified monks and the theological beliefs that led them to sacrifice everything for eternal flesh. What they left behind wasn't just a physical corpse. It was a testament to their unshakable faith in a supernatural existence beyond the veil of life. Next, we delve into the ancient rituals that set these monks on a path towards self-inflicted death, where the flesh is not only a vessel, but a temple for the soul. In the remote mountains of Japan, where the whispers of ancient monks still echo through the pine forests, a chilling yet sacred practice once took place. These monks did not seek enlightenment through meditation alone. No, they pursued the divine with an obsession that would ultimately lead them down a dark path, starving themselves to the brink of death in the name of God. This was no ordinary act of devotion. It was the ultimate, most extreme expression of faith. The monks of Mount Udono, secluded in their mountain monasteries, believed that to transcend the cycle of death and rebirth, they must first conquer their most basic human instincts, the need to eat. In this act of spiritual purification, they believed they could become one with the divine, leaving behind the mortal world forever. It was a belief so profound that it led men to defy the natural laws of life itself. What drove these monks to such extremes? Were they truly seeking divinity, or was there something darker at play? This was not a mere attempt to fast. It was a calculated and deliberate process that pushed the body beyond its natural limits. The monks entered into a ritual known as shukujo, a form of self-mummification. The very flesh they once nourished, the body that bound their souls to the earth, would become a vessel to eternal life. This wasn't about simply fasting for a few days or abstaining from food for a short period. It was about starving oneself over months, sometimes years, pushing their bodies until their organs began to shut down, all in the name of spiritual ascension. But this devotion came at a price, one that would leave these men forever changed, preserved in a state that blurred the line between life and death. These monks did not just die. They chose to become relics of their faith, their bodies preserved for eternity. To truly understand the significance of their sacrifice, we must first step into their world, where devotion was measured not in prayers or rituals, but in the decay of flesh, the silent screaming of hunger, and the ultimate quest for the divine. In the annals of history, some moments stand as pivotal turning points, where the course of faith and human endeavor intersects in a way that defies comprehension. One such moment occurred in the 8th century, when a lone monk on Mount Udono made a decision that would reverberate across generations of spiritual seekers. This monk, who would become the first to begin the process of self-mummification, believed that true enlightenment could only be achieved by transcending the physical body. His name remains lost to time, but his choice is still remembered in the bones of the mountains. It is said that this monk, in his quest for the divine, sought guidance from his spiritual ancestors and the sacred texts of his order. He had already spent decades in meditation, striving for nirvana, but he felt something was still missing, an essential key to unlocking the highest state of spiritual purity. This was when he came across the doctrine of the mummified saint, a belief that the ultimate form of self-sacrifice was to surrender the flesh entirely, allowing it to decay and transform into something eternal. The monk's decision was not taken lightly. It was one born out of a deep, almost obsessive conviction that only by severing the ties to the earthly body could he truly connect with the divine. The act itself was described as the final purification. With the backing of his monastic order, he began the process, knowing full well that it would lead him into a state of extreme suffering and eventual death. His mind was clear. This was his path to eternity. To begin the journey, the monk began with a strict and elaborate regimen, gradually reducing his intake of food and water. His goal wasn't just to starve his body. It was to rid himself of any earthly attachments, including the need for sustenance. He fasted first for days, then for weeks, all while continuing his religious duties and keeping his mind focused on the spiritual goal. But as his body weakened, the monk's resolve only grew stronger. His every movement, his every breath, was a step closer to spiritual purity and, in his mind, the threshold of immortality. It wasn't long before his body began to show the signs of starvation. His skin grew pale, his muscles atrophied, and his once vibrant spirit began to flicker. But still, he did not relent. The monks who cared for him were astonished by his unwavering faith and the lengths he was willing to go to. He was no longer just a monk. He had become a living testament to the pursuit of divine transcendence. As his body deteriorated, the very concept of life and death became blurred. Was he alive? Was he dead? For the monk, it didn't matter. What mattered was the faith that guided him to this point, the belief that through suffering, his soul would ascend to a higher plane of existence. The monk's suffering reached its peak when his organs began to fail. Yet in the deepest, most horrific stages of his fast, the monk remained spiritually centered, meditating for hours on end. It was said that his final thoughts were not of regret, but of peace. He had fulfilled his purpose. And when he finally passed, his body was not allowed to return to the earth. Instead, it was preserved, a sacred artifact, a symbol of his devotion and his choice to transcend mortality. His body would become the first of many to undergo the terrifying and sacred process of self-mummification, a practice that would haunt the mountains of Japan for centuries to come. As the first monk's body was prepared for its final rest, the question lingered. Had he achieved divinity, or had he been consumed by his own obsession? His body, preserved in its final state, would answer that question for generations to come. As the centuries passed, the practice of self-mummification began to spread among certain Buddhist sects across Japan. It was not enough for the monks to meditate in silence or recite ancient scriptures. They now sought the ultimate form of purification, a practice so extreme that it blurred the boundaries between life and death. The path to self-mummification became known as shukujo, the pursuit of perfecting the body through starvation, isolation, and ultimately, death. The monks who followed in the footsteps of the first self-mummified saint were driven by an unwavering belief that their suffering would bring them closer to achieving nirvana, the ultimate state of enlightenment. It was a concept deeply rooted in the Buddhist understanding of life and death, that all physical attachments must be severed in order to reach the realm of immortality. These monks believed that their physical bodies were nothing more than a temporary shell, a vessel for the soul. To free the soul, they would rid themselves of this earthly prison, leaving behind only the spirit. But why choose such a harrowing path? Why endure unimaginable physical pain, hunger, and deprivation? The answer lies in the Buddhist belief in self-mastery. By willingly submitting their bodies to the rigors of self-mummification, these monks sought to demonstrate their ultimate control over the human condition. It was believed that by overcoming the need for food, the most primal human desire, they would gain mastery over their physical existence, transcending it entirely. The process began with a gradual reduction of food. At first, the monks would fast for short periods, perhaps only a few days or weeks. But as their bodies adjusted, they would lengthen the fasting periods, slowly starving themselves into a state of near death. The ultimate goal was to enter a stage of near mummification while still alive. It was said that this extended period of fasting would allow the body to enter a suspended state of decay, preserving it after death in a state that was both holy and eternal. The monks would isolate themselves, often withdrawing from the world and seeking seclusion in remote temples or caves. Here, they would meditate for hours, focusing their minds on achieving spiritual enlightenment while physically deteriorating. Their bodies shrank, their faces hollowed out, and their once strong limbs became frail and weak. Yet, they remained determined, driven by the belief that the suffering they endured was the price of divine understanding. The deeper they went into this self-imposed starvation, the closer they felt to the divine. The isolation was as much spiritual as it was physical. The monks sought complete separation from the outside world, hoping that by severing all human attachments, food, companionship, and even the natural world, they could transcend the human condition and ascend into a higher realm of consciousness. It was a journey into the unknown, where the only certainty was that death awaited them. Yet they welcomed it, knowing that death was not an end, but a gateway to eternal life. But the suffering was not without its toll. The monks' bodies began to deteriorate rapidly as they approached the final stages of the ritual. The smell of decay would fill their hermitages, the foul stench of starvation and death that marked the transition from life to afterlife. And as their bodies withered, their minds entered a state of spiritual ecstasy, as though they could see beyond the veil of death, glimpsing the truth of the universe. The act of self-mummification was no longer just a physical ordeal. It was a profound metaphysical journey, where each moment of suffering was seen as a step closer to divinity. In the final stages, the monks would be so weak that they could no longer meditate. But still, they pressed on, their breath shallow and their hearts slowing. The transition between life and death became a hazy blur, a moment where time seemed to stop. And when death finally came, it was not met with fear or resistance, but with acceptance. They had completed the journey. Their bodies, now lifeless, would be preserved as sacred relics for future generations. The final act of self-mummification was a testament to the monks' belief in eternal life and their willingness to endure suffering in the pursuit of spiritual ascension. They had chosen this path freely, knowing the cost, but believing that the reward would be a life beyond death, a life where their bodies would continue to serve as holy vessels of divine wisdom. The monks who chose the path of self-mummification did not starve themselves indiscriminately. Their diets were carefully planned, a sacred ritual in itself. The monks' food intake was not simply about survival. It was about purifying the body, preparing it for the ultimate transformation. Every aspect of their diet, however simple or unorthodox, played a crucial role in their religious journey. This sacred hunger was a cornerstone of their faith, and every morsel consumed, or withheld, held profound spiritual significance. In the early stages of the self-mummification process, the monks began with a diet specifically designed to reduce their body's natural fat and prepare for the intense starvation ahead. They would consume only the most basic and austere foods, mostly rice, grains, and vegetables, carefully measured to ensure that their bodies would slowly enter a state of energy depletion. But the food was not simply sustenance. It was a tool for purification. The monks believed that by eating only simple, unseasoned foods, they could rid themselves of the indulgences and distractions of the physical world, which might otherwise hinder their spiritual journey. As the process progressed, the monks began to drastically reduce their food intake. The spiritual goal was not just starvation, but a highly structured reduction of sustenance designed to trigger the body's transformation. For some, the diet would eventually consist of nothing but pine needles, roots, and fungi, natural substances that would aid in the gradual detoxification of the body. These were believed to purify the system, draining the body of excess weight and leaving the monk's flesh lean and prepared for the inevitable death. The practice involved eating small, controlled amounts of these basic foods, just enough to keep the body alive, but not enough to nourish it fully. The goal was to achieve nourishment without pleasure, to sustain the body in a way that allowed the spirit to flourish while the flesh withered. For many monks, the taste of food became irrelevant. It was the effect on the body that mattered. The monks believed that by rejecting the comforts of food, they could conquer the flesh and fully dedicate themselves to their spiritual ascension. For the final stages, the monks were given a special diet of death, a substance believed to aid in their transition from life to death. This diet consisted of salted foods or tree bark, which would dehydrate the body and slow down the process of decay once they had passed. It was a final, deliberate attempt to preserve the body, allowing it to remain intact for the ceremonial mummification process after death. What is truly unsettling about this stage of starvation is the sheer willpower required to endure such a painful existence. The monks were not simply avoiding food for the sake of self-discipline. They were intentionally attempting to force their bodies to break down, to wither away in a calculated manner. They were attempting to take their bodies to the edge of life itself, relying on the belief that such intense self-purification would lead them to a higher state of existence. As these monks approached death, their bodies began to show the full effects of prolonged starvation. The skin lost its elasticity, and the bones became sharp and pronounced. Their movements slowed, their breaths became shallow, and the pain of hunger was their constant companion. Yet, even as their bodies deteriorated, the monks remained spiritually focused, meditating, praying, and believing that their physical suffering was the ultimate offering to the divine. It was not just the act of starving. It was a total surrender of the self, a dedication of the body and mind to the divine purpose. In the end, the monks' starvation was not a failure, but a final triumph. Their bodies, once full of vitality and life, would now be preserved as symbols of their unwavering faith and sacrifice. Their physical form, hollowed out by the ravages of hunger, would become a vessel for their soul's transcendence. But to the onlookers, the sight was both haunting and awe-inspiring, a testament to the limits of human endurance and the lengths to which these monks would go in search of divine union. The next stage in the self-mummification process was far more gruesome. After the monk's body was starved beyond recognition, the real mummification began, a preservation of flesh that would defy the natural decay of death itself. As the monks neared the final stages of their self-imposed fasting, their bodies grew frilier, and their spirits began to take precedence over their physical existence. At this point, the process was no longer merely about starvation. It had become a deeply spiritual journey into the unknown. The monks would retreat to remote caves or secluded temples, isolated from the world and its temptations, as they entered what can only be described as a sacred seclusion. Isolation was integral to the process of self-mummification. The monks believed that to achieve true spiritual purity, they had to separate themselves from all worldly distractions, even the companionship of other monks. They were now alone with only their thoughts, their prayers, and the belief that their suffering would bring them closer to the divine. The isolation wasn't just physical, it was mental and spiritual. The monk had to become so detached from earthly attachments that even the bond with fellow humans was severed. It is said that during these periods of isolation, the monks experienced moments of extreme clarity. The extreme hunger and solitude caused hallucinations and visions, where the lines between life and death, the physical and the spiritual, began to blur. Some monks reported seeing the Buddha. Others claimed to have seen guardian spirits, guiding them through the suffering they were enduring. The visions were seen as divine signs, confirming that their suffering was not in vain. During their seclusion, the monks did not simply wait to die. They continued to meditate for hours, their minds focused on the goal of achieving nirvana. They would chant mantras, and many engaged in breathing exercises meant to slow their heartbeats and calm their minds, keeping their spirits tethered to their purpose. The monks also had an unwavering belief that during this period, their bodies were slowly shedding their material desires, preparing to meet death in a purified state. It was a process of mental transcendence that was just as painful and taxing as the physical ordeal they endured. Yet, even in this seclusion, the monks' suffering did not go unnoticed. Some accounts tell of monks being observed by fellow believers or their monastic order. In these final months, they were rarely visited, but their bodies and minds were still under careful watch. As their health declined, their caretakers would occasionally provide them with small amounts of food, sometimes a few grains of rice or a sip of water, though they were usually enough to keep the monks on the edge of starvation. The caretakers acted as both observers and protectors, ensuring that the monks didn't reach a state of complete deterioration before their death, which would compromise the ritual. But it wasn't only the monks who believed in the sanctity of this act. Their followers also revered them as saints, looking at their isolation as a manifestation of divine will. To the people who believed in the self-mummified monks, these men were not simply performing a religious duty, they were embodying the divine on earth. The more extreme the suffering, the more sacred the monk became. Each part of the body that withered away, each ounce of flesh that decayed, was a visible representation of their commitment to spiritual enlightenment. However, the most disturbing aspect of this final period was the decision to die alone. As the monk's body began to enter a state of advanced decay, and their organs ceased functioning, they would be forced to confront the final reality of their spiritual quest: death. This was a sacred death, not one given to the inevitable passage of time. It was chosen, self-inflicted, and utterly transcendent. There was no fear, no hesitation. The monk knew that their suffering, their isolation, and their starvation were the ultimate offerings they could give. As the final hours approached, the monk's body became frail and unrecognizable. Yet in their weakened state, they still held onto their belief that this was the true path to immortality. And as the final breath escaped their body, their soul was believed to be free, released from the constraints of the mortal world. With the monk's death, the process of mummification would begin. The body, now devoid of its human vitality, would be carefully preserved by the monk's fellow followers. This was not a natural preservation of death. The ritual mummification process was meticulous, designed to keep the monk's body intact for centuries, ensuring that their sanctity and sacrifice would endure for future generations. The monk's flesh would now be the ultimate artifact, the embodiment of spiritual purity. And so, the monk's journey, which began in isolation and suffering, culminated in the preservation of their body, a symbol of divinity and sacrifice, forever sealed in time. The practice of self-mummification was not an act of starvation alone, but one of intentional, spiritual transformation. As the monks continued to push the limits of their physical existence, they reached a state that is almost impossible to comprehend, a place where eating was not merely a choice, but a deliberate rejection of life itself. These monks sought eternal transcendence, where the need for sustenance was denied, and the act of eating was considered an anchor to the mortal world they sought to escape. The monks did not suddenly choose to stop eating one day. It was a gradual process, one that stretched over months, sometimes years. Initially, their fasting was controlled. The monks would begin with short periods of hunger, fasting for a few days, and then gradually increasing the length of time between meals. Their bodies slowly adapted to this new reality. What began as a mild discomfort soon turned into a powerful state of self-control. The monk's belief was clear. To die was to achieve divine union with the universe, and food, earthly nourishment, was a binding force that kept them trapped in the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. They had to sever all ties to this world. So, they stopped eating, not for a week or a month, but for years. As their bodies began to lose weight and their health began to decline, they were not filled with fear or weakness. Instead, they believed that they were becoming purer, shedding the mortal chains that held them back from their spiritual goal. The spiritual purpose of starvation was as much about discipline as it was about self-sacrifice. Each day without food brought the monks closer to their goal of eternal enlightenment. The idea of controlled starvation was rooted in the belief that through the self-inflicted suffering, the monk's soul could be released from the burdens of the body. The monk's ability to endure extreme hunger was a sign of their spiritual power, a testament to their mastery over their physical desires. This was no mere fast. It was a sacred undertaking. During this period, the monks consumed only small, seemingly insignificant items that helped them survive while still starving their bodies. They might nibble on pine needles or tree bark, ingesting just enough to prevent their bodies from completely shutting down. Some monks drank water laced with medicinal herbs that helped suppress hunger but did little to nourish the body. These small sustenances were merely enough to keep their heartbeats steady and their bodies from completely deteriorating before they reached the end of their ritual. The monks' once robust physiques withered into frail shells, their bones becoming more prominent with each passing day. It wasn't uncommon for them to develop severe skin conditions, their bodies slowly consuming themselves as they burned through the last reserves of their fat and muscle. Yet, the monks remained steadfast, their spiritual focus unwavering. They believed that their suffering was the price to pay for their ultimate union with the divine. What is most chilling about the starvation process was the complete surrender of the self. The monks did not fight the hunger. They welcomed it, seeing it as a purification of the soul. In a sense, the more they suffered, the closer they felt to the divine. This hunger was not only a physical sensation. It was a spiritual experience, an act of devotion so intense that the monks began to lose their connection to the mortal world entirely. They no longer recognized their bodies as their own, but as temporary vessels through which they would achieve the highest form of spiritual ascension. But starvation, no matter how disciplined, takes its toll. As the monks neared the final stages of their ritual, their physical condition became severe. Their faces became gaunt, their eyes sunken, their skin as thin as parchment. They were barely alive, yet they were far from dead. In this liminal space between life and death, the monks believed that their bodies were being prepared for the final act of mummification. Their flesh was being stripped away, leaving only the spirit, ready to ascend to eternal life. In these final stages, the monks' strength faltered, their movements slowed, but their spiritual clarity remained. They could no longer meditate or pray with the same focus as before, but their minds were still centered on the divine, believing that soon they would pass beyond the veil of death. As death approached, they would stop eating entirely, allowing the body to finish its natural decomposition. Their bodies, having been starved and cleansed of their earthly desires, would finally be ready to undergo the final phase of the self-mummification process, preservation. The monks were not simply waiting to die. They were preparing their bodies to be preserved for eternity, a symbol of their devotion, their suffering, and their transcendence. The final step in this grim process was not one of fear, but of acceptance. The monks who survived the grueling starvation ritual were now nothing more than a shell of their former selves. But in their eyes, the process was not an end, but a new beginning. They had transcended the need for food, the physical world, and their bodies themselves. They had become living symbols of divine devotion, and their bodies, soon to be mummified, would remain as holy relics for future generations to behold. As the monks approached the final stages of their self-imposed starvation, the boundaries between reality and the divine began to blur. The severe deprivation of food and water, coupled with the isolation and intense meditation, triggered a state of profound mental and spiritual upheaval. The monks began to experience visions, hallucinations so vivid that they were often seen as divine revelations. These spiritual visions were interpreted as signs from the Buddha or the spirits of ancestors, guiding the monks on their final journey towards enlightenment. The isolation and hunger heightened their sensitivity to the spiritual realm. In this altered state of consciousness, the monks no longer saw the world around them in the same way. Hallucinations, whether they took the form of ethereal beings, divine figures, or otherworldly landscapes, were seen as manifestations of the ultimate truth they sought to attain. Some monks claimed to have seen the Buddha, surrounded by a radiant light, offering them peace and guidance. Others believed they encountered guardian spirits, who spoke to them in cryptic messages, urging them to continue their journey. The visions became increasingly frequent as the monks' bodies weakened. These apparitions were not frightening. Instead, they were seen as comforting and reassuring. The monks interpreted these spiritual encounters as proof that they were on the right path, that their suffering was a necessary sacrifice for the ultimate union with the divine. They no longer feared death, for they believed that they were being guided by the divine presence into a state of eternal peace. Yet, not all of the visions were peaceful. For some monks, the hunger and isolation drove them to the edge of madness, causing them to experience terrifying hallucinations of demons, ghosts, and dark spirits. The mind, starved and exhausted, became fertile ground for the manifestation of both comforting and unsettling visions. These dark hallucinations were seen as trials to test the monk's spiritual resolve. Overcoming these terrifying visions was viewed as a sign of purity, proof that the monk had achieved mastery over the physical and mental suffering of starvation. One of the most chilling aspects of these visions was the belief that the monks could see beyond death. Some monks reported witnessing the death of their own bodies, as though they were already looking at their decomposing forms from a spiritual vantage point. This phenomenon, often described as an out-of-body experience, was seen as a sign of spiritual enlightenment. The monks were not merely waiting for death to take them. They were already interacting with it, observing their bodies deteriorating in preparation for the final transformation. In these final, delirious days, the monks would often find themselves talking to their hallucinations as if they were real. Conversations with the Buddha, ancestors, or spirits were not viewed as mere delusions. They were seen as direct communication with the divine. It was during these moments that the monks believed they were receiving the final teachings of their faith, the last wisdom before passing into eternity. The visions also took on a symbolic significance. For many monks, seeing the Buddha or other divine beings was believed to be a sign that they had passed through the trials of suffering and had reached the threshold of nirvana. The final hallucinations served as the ultimate confirmation that they were ready to depart from the earthly realm and enter the next phase of existence. Death was no longer a fear, but a welcomed passage to a higher plane. At the same time, the monks' physical bodies, weakened by months or years of starvation, were becoming more and more unrecognizable. They could no longer stand or walk, and their once vibrant eyes now appeared hollow. Yet, despite their physical frailty, the monks remained deeply focused on their spiritual mission. They were no longer concerned with food or water. They were concerned with their soul's ascension. Their bodies were nothing more than a vessel, soon to be left behind in favor of the eternal. But the hallucinations were not just about comfort. They were also about preparation. These visions, whether peaceful or terrifying, were seen as a spiritual guide leading the monks toward their final transformation. Their suffering had not been in vain. It had led them to this final moment, where they were able to transcend the physical world and prepare for the afterlife. The monk's body was but a shell. The visions promised that their true self, free from earthly suffering, was about to emerge. When death finally came, it wasn't a sudden end. The monks often passed away quietly, surrounded by their hallucinations, as though transitioning gently into the next life. Their bodies, frail and starved, would be carefully prepared for mummification, a final act of preservation for a monk who had willingly transcended the limits of mortality. The rituals of self-mummification were complete, but what the monks left behind, these living relics, were more than just preserved bodies. They were symbols of unshakable faith, of divine dedication, and of the lengths to which a person could go in search of immortality. The monks had not simply died. They had become divine in the process. Their mummified remains standing as eternal reminders of their sacrifice. The act of self-mummification was not merely an extreme physical practice. It was deeply rooted in theology. For the monks who chose this path, their bodies were not simply physical vessels. They were sacred, divine instruments of spiritual purification. In the ancient Buddhist traditions that influenced the practice, the body was seen as both a means of transcendence and a hindrance to spiritual enlightenment. The monks who undertook self-mummification believed that in order to achieve nirvana or ultimate enlightenment, they must rid themselves of all earthly attachments, most importantly, the attachment to the physical body. The Buddhist concept of impermanence, anicca, teaches that everything in the material world is transient. Life, death, and the physical form are fleeting, and attachment to them only leads to suffering. For these monks, their physical bodies were seen as the greatest form of attachment. They were symbols of impermanence, of human limitations. Thus, by mummifying themselves, they sought to transform their bodies into something permanent, something beyond the natural decay of flesh. The act of starving and preserving the body was a way of transcending its mortal limitations and achieving a form of eternal existence. The monks believed that in purifying the body through starvation, they could rid themselves of earthly desires. The Buddhist doctrine of the 5 hindrances, desire, aversion, sloth, restlessness, and doubt, teaches that these attachments prevent the soul from reaching enlightenment. By refusing to eat, the monks were not just purging their bodies of food, they were purging their desires. Hunger was seen as a direct means of detachment, and through this detachment, the monk could achieve a clearer, more direct connection to the divine. Their body would become the vessel for a purified soul, capable of ascending to higher realms. This belief was anchored in the concept of the sacred corpse. In Buddhist culture, the body was not just a physical entity. It was believed to be a vessel that could carry the spirit to enlightenment. The self-mummified monks, by choosing to preserve their flesh, were turning their bodies into holy relics. They were offering their bodies as living sacrifices, ensuring that their physical forms would outlive them, standing as eternal symbols of their dedication and purity. Monks who self-mummified believed that through their death, they would achieve a state of immortality. The mummified body was not a dead body. It was seen as an eternal presence, a powerful spiritual icon. The preserved body was a direct connection to the divine, allowing future generations to draw inspiration and faith from the monk's sacrifice. These preserved bodies became sacred relics, objects of veneration that carried with them the monk's spiritual power and wisdom. The process of self-mummification also involved deep meditation and ritual. The monks, through their meditative practices, aligned their bodies and minds in such a way that they believed they could transcend the normal physical process of decomposition. It was said that the monks believed their bodies could transform into divine vessels, carrying the essence of their spirit even after death. They viewed their bodies as temples, ones that could withstand the ravages of time and decay because their spirit had already transcended the physical realm. The act of mummification was, in essence, a way of turning the physical into the spiritual. Moreover, the preservation of the monk's body was not just about staving off death, but about defying nature. By choosing to preserve the body through such extreme means, the monk was asserting their will over nature itself. They were claiming mastery over life and death, proving that through faith and suffering, they could escape the ordinary cycle of birth and rebirth that governs most lives. The Buddhist idea of reincarnation also played a role in this belief system. In many Buddhist traditions, reincarnation is viewed as the cycle of life and death that is perpetuated by attachment and desire. By self-mummifying, the monks hoped to break free from this cycle. They were not simply choosing death. They were choosing eternal existence without reincarnation, preserving their souls in their bodies for future generations to witness and revere. This was a final rejection of the physical world, a way to achieve spiritual immortality. However, the monk's practice of self-mummification was also a deeply personal act of devotion. It was an offering of the self, a way to demonstrate their unwavering faith in the Buddhist teachings. Their mummified bodies stood as the ultimate symbol of their belief in the possibility of a spiritual transcendence that went beyond the limitations of human life. For the monks, their bodies were the ultimate form of devotion. By rejecting them, they gave themselves fully to the divine, leaving behind an eternal reminder of their sacrifice. This theology was radical, challenging not only the natural order, but also the way in which people viewed life, death, and the body. It raised profound questions about the nature of the human soul, the importance of the physical body, and the idea of eternal life. The monks did not fear death, nor did they see their self-mummification as a morbid act. They viewed it as a holy duty, one that would ultimately lead them to a higher state of being. The first successful self-mummified monk was not merely a curious anomaly in history. He was the beginning of a sacred tradition that would span centuries. After months, even years, of intense fasting, isolation, and meditation, the monk's body was finally ready for what would be the most delicate phase of the process: preservation. His body, now frail and wasted from starvation, would undergo an intricate mummification procedure that ensured he would be preserved for generations. The monk's followers were tasked with carefully tending to his remains, for what they had witnessed was not just death, it was a transformation. Once the monk had passed, the physical body was often placed in a small wooden hut or a stone tomb, where it was carefully sealed off from the elements. The monks who oversaw the process would begin the mummification by removing the organs from the deceased monk's body. This was a necessary step to prevent decay and preserve the body for as long as possible. The organs, which could decompose rapidly, were removed and often preserved separately in a similar fashion, ensuring that the monk's body would remain intact. But the mummification process didn't stop with just the removal of organs. The monk's body would then be bathed in a mixture of herbs, oils, and salt, substances believed to help dehydrate and preserve the body. This treatment would halt the decay, essentially stopping the natural process of rot, and help preserve the body in a mummified state. For months, sometimes years, the body would be carefully maintained. The mummified monks were then placed in specially crafted wooden coffins or stone shrines, often in a seated position, as if in eternal meditation. These bodies, though physically lifeless, were seen by the followers as holy relics, embodiments of the monks' sacrifice and devotion to the divine. The monks' mummified bodies would stand as eternal symbols of their spiritual victory over the flesh, and their preserved forms would be venerated as sacred objects of worship. As word spread of the success of these mummification rituals, other monks sought to follow in the footsteps of the first self-mummified monk. The process was grueling, and not all who attempted it succeeded. Many who tried died before reaching the final stages of mummification, their bodies not able to endure the extreme rigors of starvation and isolation. But for those who did succeed, their preserved remains became the centerpiece of devotion, offering a lasting legacy of their spiritual journey. The mummies were not just seen as preserved bodies. They were believed to be eternal witnesses to the faith, as if the monks had transcended the physical world and had become permanent reminders of the possibility of divine ascension. Their preserved forms were often placed in temples or shrines, where the faithful would come to pay their respects, hoping to draw spiritual power from their remains. But the mummies were not just sacred relics for worship. They were also a symbol of what it meant to truly conquer death. These monks, who had starved themselves to the point of death, had become living icons of spiritual purity. Their bodies were not simply mummified. They were transformed into sacred vessels that embodied the very ideals of their faith. They were proof that, through the severing of all earthly desires and attachments, one could achieve an eternal connection with the divine. But with the unveiling of the first mummies came a dark side to the practice, what many considered to be the moral cost of such devotion. The act of self-mummification was not only a grueling, physically torturous process, but also raised profound questions about the role of the body in spiritual transformation. Was it truly necessary for a monk to starve himself to death to achieve enlightenment? And what did it say about the monks' faith that they were willing to sacrifice their very flesh for the possibility of spiritual transcendence? The mummies, now enshrined as sacred icons, continued to draw both admiration and fear. While many saw them as symbols of ultimate devotion and faith, others began to question whether such practices were truly necessary for spiritual growth. The body, after all, was still an earthly vessel, and to treat it as a mere object of sacrifice raised troubling questions about the limits of devotion. Could a monk truly achieve nirvana by subjecting their body to such extreme measures, or had they merely fallen prey to an obsessive belief in the afterlife? Nevertheless, the mummified monks remained an enduring mystery, figures that defied the natural order of life and death, standing as both spiritual icons and chilling reminders of the human capacity for self-sacrifice. The practice of self-mummification continued for centuries, becoming more refined, yet never losing its mystical allure. These mummies would forever stand as eerie, sacred monuments to the monks' ultimate sacrifice and a testament to the power of belief, devotion, and the desire to transcend the earthly realm. Once the monks had passed away, their journey was far from over. The next crucial step in the process of self-mummification was the meticulous preservation of their bodies. To ensure that the monks' sacrifice was not wasted, their bodies underwent a detailed and precise mummification process, a ritual that was both a physical and spiritual undertaking. This was no simple embalming. It was a sacred act meant to halt the natural decay of flesh and preserve the monk's body for eternity, symbolizing the permanence of their devotion and faith. The first step in mummification involved the careful removal of the internal organs, a crucial process meant to prevent decomposition. The stomach, intestines, and lungs were carefully extracted, as these were the first to decay. The monks believed that by removing these organs, they were purging the body of the material desires that had once plagued it. In their place, the organs were either discarded or preserved separately, depending on the specific rituals followed. The next phase was the cleaning and drying of the body. The monk's body was often washed with a mixture of herbs, salts, and sometimes medicinal oils to begin the preservation process. The monk's body was then placed in a drying chamber or exposed to heat for several weeks. The goal was to dry out the body as much as possible, which would prevent it from decaying. This step was vital to the mummification process because moisture was the primary factor that caused decomposition. Once the body had been sufficiently dried, it would undergo a final stage of preservation using a mix of substances like salt, pine resin, and camphor, all of which helped to seal the body and further slow down the natural decomposition process. The monks believed that these materials would also imbue the body with a certain spiritual protection, preventing it from being harmed or tainted by external forces. As part of the ritual, the monk's body would be placed in a sitting position, often cross-legged in the traditional meditative posture. This wasn't just for the sake of aesthetics. It was a deliberate attempt to keep the monk's spiritual purity intact. By preserving the body in a seated position, the monks believed they were symbolizing the monk's continued meditation and focus on the divine, even in death. Their final position in life was to be one of eternal contemplation. Once preserved, the body was then placed in a specially constructed tomb or shrine, often made of wood or stone. The tomb would be sealed, sometimes in a mountain cave or a hidden shrine, to keep the monk's body isolated from the outside world. This not only allowed the body to remain undisturbed, but also symbolized the monk's final departure from the physical world. It was their last act of spiritual ascension, and now their preserved body would serve as a vessel for eternal meditation. The monk's body would sometimes be covered in sacred robes or ritualistic garb, each item of clothing imbued with its own spiritual significance. These garments were often adorned with religious symbols or mantras, further emphasizing the monk's devotion and belief in eternal life. The body's final appearance was that of a sacred relic, one that not only symbolized the monk's physical sacrifice, but also embodied their spiritual journey. For the faithful, these mummified remains became objects of veneration. The preserved monk was no longer seen as a mere mortal. They had transcended human form and were now viewed as a direct link to the divine. The act of worshiping the mummified monks was not just about honoring the physical body. It was about recognizing the monks' achievement of nirvana and the transcendence of their spirit. Followers would visit the shrines where the monks' bodies were preserved, hoping to draw spiritual power from the remains and to honor the sacrifices made for their faith. However, the act of self-mummification raised unsettling questions. Could a human truly transcend death through the preservation of their physical body? Was the act of starving oneself and subjecting the body to such extreme suffering truly in line with the principles of Buddhism? The monks who followed this path saw themselves as pioneers of spiritual perfection. But to others, it seemed like an unhealthy obsession with the afterlife, one that ignored the true meaning of enlightenment. Despite these questions, the mummified bodies stood as sacred reminders of the lengths to which these monks went to in their quest for spiritual enlightenment. They were both symbols of devotion and sacrifice, and each preserved body told the story of a monk who was willing to abandon the physical world to achieve a higher state of being. To the faithful, the mummies were not just dead bodies. They were holy figures, forever enshrined in the eternal pursuit of divine transcendence. Once the monks' bodies had been carefully mummified, preserved, and placed in their final resting places, the sacred journey did not end. The mummified monks remained a profound part of the community, their bodies serving as eternal reminders of the devotion and spiritual ascension they had achieved. But what happened after the mummification process? The preservation of the body was only the first step in ensuring that these monks continued to exert influence on their followers. For centuries, the mummified monks remained objects of reverence. Their shrines became sites of pilgrimage, where believers traveled great distances to pay their respects, pray for blessings, and seek guidance. In many cases, these mummified saints were seen not as simply deceased, but as immortal guardians whose preserved bodies held sacred, divine power. People believed that by touching or offering prayers near the monks' mummified remains, they could receive spiritual enlightenment, protection from harm, and answers to their most pressing questions. But the significance of the mummies was not just confined to the living. Over time, these preserved bodies were said to communicate with their followers in mysterious ways. There were reports of monks' bodies moving or even changing position, as if still alive and interacting with the living world. In some instances, people claimed to witness subtle shifts in facial expressions, as if the monks were responding to the prayers and devotions of the faithful. This inexplicable phenomenon only increased the mystique surrounding the self-mummified monks, further cementing their place as divine beings, no longer bound by the constraints of the human world. The monks' shrines and resting places often became sacred pilgrimage sites, attracting hundreds or even thousands of visitors annually. The faithful would bring offerings, light incense, and perform rituals around the mummified remains, hoping to receive blessings, healing, or a deeper connection to the divine. The remains of the monks became not only religious symbols, but also cultural treasures, artifacts that represented a shared history of devotion, sacrifice, and the pursuit of eternal life. While the monks' bodies were preserved as holy relics, the people who cared for them also played an essential role in the practice. Often, it was the monastic order or designated caretakers who maintained the mummies and ensured that they remained in pristine condition. The mummified bodies were sometimes bathed in oils, cleaned, and even reclothed as part of an ongoing ritual of reverence. These caretakers, often seen as spiritual stewards, ensured that the mummified monks remained objects of veneration and continued to inspire awe and devotion. But as time went on, the practice of self-mummification began to lose favor in some regions. The decline in the number of monks willing to undergo such a grueling process and the growing concerns about its physical and psychological toll led to a gradual end of the tradition. The mummified bodies, once revered and preserved as eternal symbols of divine enlightenment, slowly began to fade into the background of religious history. Despite the decline of the practice, the mummified monks left behind an indelible mark on history. Their bodies, now preserved for centuries, stood as eternal testaments to their extreme devotion and the lengths they were willing to go to achieve spiritual transcendence. But as the years passed and the mummification practice became increasingly rare, the mystery of the self-mummified monks began to take on an almost legendary quality. Today, the few mummified monks that remain are often stored in museum collections, revered in religious shrines, or kept in private temples. Their stories are still told, but the physical bodies that once held such profound spiritual significance are now increasingly seen as mysterious relics of the past. Yet, they still inspire fascination and awe, reminders of an age-old practice that defied the natural order of life and death. Despite their decline, the mummified monks continue to provoke questions and debate. Were their actions the result of divine insight, or were they simply the manifestation of a deeply entrenched obsession with the afterlife? Were these monks truly seeking spiritual purity, or were they victims of their own extreme beliefs? The practice of self-mummification raises unsettling questions about the boundaries between faith and fanaticism, devotion and madness. In the end, the mummified monks stand as powerful symbols of human resilience and the desire to transcend the physical world. Their bodies, preserved against time and decay, continue to challenge our understanding of the spiritual and the physical, and to remind us of the lengths to which some will go to achieve what they believe to be eternal life. The mummified monks, preserved in their sacred tombs, did not remain static for long. Over time, their bodies transcended their status as mere remains. They became revered icons of divine grace. Their mummified remains held an aura of immortality, viewed as direct vessels to the divine. These monks, who had once walked the earth in pursuit of spiritual purity, were now immortalized as living reminders of faith, sacrifice, and devotion. They were not simply dead. They were spiritually alive in the eyes of their followers. For the faithful, these mummies represented much more than relics. They became symbols of divine protection, venerated by followers as objects of worship. People who visited the tombs of these monks were not only seeking physical blessings, but spiritual guidance. The belief was that, through their intense suffering and ultimate sacrifice, the monks had achieved a state of divine transcendence. Their bodies, though physically lifeless, carried an aura of holiness, believed to offer a spiritual connection to the divine that no living being could replicate. In the sacred shrines where these mummified monks were enshrined, visitors would often engage in ritualistic practices. Offerings of incense, flowers, and prayers were left at the feet of the monks' preserved remains. The faithful believed that by praying in front of these mummified bodies, they could receive blessings of protection, healing, and spiritual enlightenment. The monks' bodies were seen as holy artifacts, the ultimate manifestation of their unwavering devotion to their faith. To touch them, or even be near them, was considered a privilege, one that brought the faithful closer to the divine. Monastic caretakers and religious leaders, who had taken on the role of overseeing the mummified monks' tombs, carefully ensured that these bodies remained in their preserved state. Over the years, the mummies were bathed in oils, cleaned, and often reclothed in sacred garments to keep them looking as they had in life. The act of maintaining these remains was seen as a sacred duty, and the caretakers were viewed as the monks' spiritual descendants, tasked with preserving not only the bodies but also the teachings they left behind. The mummies were not merely held up as examples of spiritual purity. They became a source of power and wisdom for those who sought guidance. In some temples, the bodies of the mummified monks were said to exude spiritual energy, a phenomenon that some claimed could heal ailments or offer protection from harm. Followers believed that by coming into direct contact with the monks' remains, they could receive a blessing that transcended the material world. These mummified bodies were living proof that the monks had conquered the natural cycle of life and death. As the centuries passed, the mummified monks continued to draw pilgrims from all over, who would travel vast distances to see them and pay their respects. The legacy of the self-mummified monks, though fading in some places, lived on in the spiritual hearts of their followers. The belief in their immortal presence persisted, even as the practice of self-mummification dwindled. The mummies had become icons, revered for their extreme dedication, and for the profound faith they had shown in their pursuit of spiritual enlightenment. But the deification of the monks' bodies also raised complex questions. Could the monks' spiritual journey truly be encapsulated in the preservation of their physical body, or was it the monk's soul and teachings that truly lived on, as the mummified remains were venerated? Were the followers too focused on the physical rather than the spiritual message of the monk's life? Despite these questions, the mummified monks remained icons of sacrifice, eternal symbols of the lengths to which some would go to achieve spiritual purity. Their bodies were no longer just flesh and bone. They had become the ultimate expression of faith and devotion. They embodied the mysticism and moral complexities of human belief, demonstrating the extremes to which devotion can be taken in the pursuit of divine transcendence. The mummified remains of the monks stand today not only as a testament to their religious sacrifice, but also as a profound reminder of the power of the human spirit. In their final moments, these monks chose to give everything, body, mind, and soul, to achieve a connection with the divine. And though their bodies may have crumbled with the passing of time, their legacy continues to live on in the hearts of those who still seek enlightenment, still bow in awe before the sacred relics, still believe that through devotion we can overcome the very limits of mortality. While the mummified monks were revered as sacred relics of divine transcendence, their journey was not without its grim realities. The path they chose, self-imposed starvation and extreme deprivation, was a physical ordeal that often led to severe consequences. The price of immortality was not just spiritual, but profoundly physical, as the monks subjected their bodies to torturous conditions that ultimately took a devastating toll on their health. The process of self-mummification required the monks to fast for extended periods, sometimes years, which led to the gradual deterioration of their bodies. Initially, the monks experienced the natural effects of starvation, fatigue, dizziness, and weakness. As their bodies consumed themselves to survive, their muscles wasted away, their skin grew thin and leathery, and their organs began to fail. The hunger, an insatiable void that could never truly be filled, became their constant companion, a reminder of the extreme measures they had taken in the name of their faith. Despite the slow decay, the monks believed that their suffering was divinely ordained, a purification of the body to rid it of earthly desires. However, the reality of starvation was far more brutal than any spiritual metaphor. The body systems began to collapse as it entered a state of extreme malnutrition. The brain, deprived of the energy it needed to function properly, caused erratic behavior and difficulty concentrating. Many monks experienced psychological deterioration, such as delusions and hallucinations, which were often seen as signs of spiritual visions but were also symptoms of the body's collapse. The pain of hunger was only part of the physical toll. Without sufficient nutrition, the monks' immune systems became increasingly compromised, making them vulnerable to infections and disease. The body's natural healing processes were impaired, and wounds or sores would take longer to heal, often leading to secondary infections. Organ failure was inevitable, and many monks died prematurely before completing the process. In some cases, their bodies simply gave out long before they could reach the final stages of mummification. The mummification process was supposed to preserve the monk's body in a state of spiritual purity, but the reality was far darker. By the time the monks' bodies were ready for preservation, their internal organs were often so damaged that they were beyond saving. Despite this, the ritual continued, and the monks' remains were sometimes preserved in a state of extreme deterioration. The mummification process could only do so much to stop the natural decay of the body, and many monks were left in a grim state of partial decomposition. The monks who survived the longest in this ritual often displayed the most severe signs of physical damage. Their bones, once strong and vibrant, became brittle and easily broken. Their joints became stiff, and their skin lost its elasticity, leaving them looking more like corpse-like figures than the revered saints they were believed to be. Yet, despite the physical toll, these monks remained convinced that they were ascending spiritually, and their bodies, though withered and damaged, were vessels of divine power. Even after their death, the dangers of self-mummification continued. Many of the monks who had undergone the ritual were buried in remote places, sometimes in secluded caves or hidden tombs, to ensure their preservation. Their mummified bodies, though carefully sealed in sacred shrines, still faced the ravages of time and natural forces. In some cases, the extreme temperatures of the tombs or the humidity of the caves caused the mummies to deteriorate further, reducing them to little more than skeletons over time. This raises a disturbing question. Did the monks truly transcend their earthly bodies, or were they simply victims of their extreme faith? They believed that through their suffering and eventual mummification, they could achieve immortality. But was the cost of this immortality truly worth it? The practice of self-mummification highlighted the fine line between devotion and obsession, and it is unclear whether these monks ever truly achieved the divine transcendence they sought, or whether they were merely caught in the grip of their own extreme beliefs. The practice's decline over time may reflect the growing realization of the dangers associated with such extreme devotion. While self-mummification was seen as a profound act of spiritual purification and transcendence, it also raised uncomfortable truths about the human body's limits. The monk's body was not immortal. It was frail, susceptible to harm, and bound by the laws of nature. And yet, the monks believed they could conquer these limits, choosing to push their bodies to the breaking point in search of a higher purpose. The legacy of these mummified monks, therefore, remains as much about the sacrifice as it is about the cost of their immortality. The question remains, did they find what they were searching for, or did they fall prey to their own extreme devotion? As the mummified monks became objects of devotion, their preserved bodies were revered as symbols of spiritual purity. Yet the practice that led to their mummification continued to raise ethical dilemmas and moral questions. For the monks themselves, the path of self-mummification was clear. It was a path to ultimate transcendence, a way to free the soul from the limitations of the body. But for the people who revered them, the question lingered, was it truly worth the cost? The practice of self-mummification wasn't just about starving the body. It was about destroying the self to achieve enlightenment. The monks didn't just abandon food and comfort. They abandoned their very humanity, willingly subjecting their bodies to torture and slow death for the sake of an idea that by freeing themselves from the physical form, they could achieve a higher spiritual state. But this act of self-sacrifice came with consequences that even the most devout followers began to question. For many, the sight of the mummified monks was both awe-inspiring and disturbing. Their preserved bodies, though seen as sacred relics, were reminders of the extreme lengths the monks had gone to in their devotion to the Buddhist faith. But was this the true path to spiritual enlightenment, or had the monks been misguided by their extreme beliefs? The very act of starving themselves until their bodies could no longer function, until they became living corpses, was undeniably unnatural. The monks themselves believed they were purifying the soul through their suffering, but to many, it seemed as though they were simply allowing their bodies to fall victim to their own obsessive devotion. The practice also raised troubling questions for the monks' followers. Was it right to revere a body that had been so ravaged by starvation and neglect? Should the body of a monk who had abandoned all earthly pleasures be treated as a holy object, or was this a misguided veneration of a process that destroyed the physical form in the name of spiritual purity? For some followers, the mummified monk's body was a reminder of their faith's powerful ideals, a symbol of what could be achieved through pure devotion. But for others, it was a stark reminder of how far a human could go in the name of religion, sacrificing their humanity in the process. And yet, Despite these ethical dilemmas, the practice of self-mummification continued in some remote regions, where it remained a sacred tradition passed down from generation to generation. The monks who attempted the process did so with unwavering belief, driven by the idea that their suffering would transcend the limits of their physical bodies and bring them closer to nirvana, a state of divine peace. For them, there was no question of whether it was worth it. The spiritual rewards they sought were beyond the realm of earthly understanding, and they believed that their extreme devotion would be rewarded in the afterlife. But for the outside world, the practice was increasingly viewed with discomfort and skepticism. Was it possible that the monks had misunderstood the true path to enlightenment? Could they have achieved spiritual ascension without inflicting such harm on their bodies? These questions haunted the followers and outsiders alike, leaving them to wonder whether extreme self-sacrifice could ever be justified in the name of faith. Despite the moral quandaries surrounding the practice, the mummified monks continue to serve as potent symbols of devotion, sacrifice, and faith. For the faithful, these monks had succeeded where others had failed. They had purified their souls and achieved a level of spiritual ascension beyond human comprehension. But for those who questioned the necessity of such extreme acts, the monks' mummification remained a tragic testimony to the dangers of religious extremism and the price of seeking immortality. Ultimately, the question of whether the practice was worth it may never be fully answered. For some, the suffering and sacrifice were an inevitable part of the journey toward divine enlightenment, while for others, the monks had gone too far, turning the body into a tool for religious obsession rather than a vessel for the soul. What remains undeniable is the legacy these monks left behind. Their mummified bodies stand not only as objects of spiritual reverence, but as stark reminders of the limits of the human body and the uncompromising devotion that led them to sacrifice it. As the mummified monks became revered objects of spiritual devotion, a darker narrative began to emerge, a narrative that spoke not only of veneration, but of fear. For some, the sight of the preserved monks' bodies was not a comforting symbol of faith, but a chilling reminder of the high price of immortality. The monks had gone to unimaginable lengths to transcend the mortal realm, but in doing so, they had also exposed themselves to the risks of a dark legacy, one that would forever haunt the temples, shrines, and tombs where their mummies were kept. There were whispers among the faithful that the mummified monks were not merely symbols of sacrifice and spiritual purity. Some believed that the monks' extreme devotion had triggered a curse that bound their souls to their bodies for all eternity. It was said that the very act of self-mummification, of forcing the body to endure such suffering, had created a bond between the spirit and the decaying flesh. This unnatural bond was thought to trap the monk's soul in a perpetual state of limbo, unable to fully ascend to the afterlife. The mummified monks, in this view, were not at peace. Instead, they were thought to be trapped in an eternal purgatory, neither alive nor dead, bound to their preserved bodies by their unwavering devotion. The monks' souls, never able to fully let go of the physical world, were believed to linger in the tombs, causing misfortune and unexplained phenomena around their shrines. There were accounts of visitors to the tombs who claimed to feel an unnatural chill in the air, or even see shadowy figures move in and out of the monks' shrines. Some reported hearing whispers or feeling the sensation of being watched by invisible eyes. These eerie occurrences were often attributed to the monks themselves, thought to be the restless spirits of those who had denied their own natural death in favor of a forced immortality. The mummies, it seemed, were more than just relics. They had become conduits for a spiritual darkness. The very purity that had allowed the monks to transcend the mortal realm was now seen as the source of their cursed existence. The intense physical suffering that had been part of their self-sacrifice had, in a way, twisted the purity of their souls, binding them forever to their decaying bodies. For some, this curse became the defining characteristic of the self-mummification process. It was no longer just a spiritual journey, but a dangerous path fraught with supernatural consequences. In some regions, The monks' tombs became places of fear and superstition. Though people still visited, the veneration of the mummified bodies was tinged with trepidation. The monks' extreme actions, which had once been seen as a pure spiritual offering, now seemed like a warning, a cautionary tale of what can happen when the human body is pushed beyond its natural limits. In rare cases, those who came into contact with the mummified monks, particularly those who tried to disturb or tamper with the remains, reported sudden illnesses or misfortune. Some claimed that their lives were cursed by the very monks they had sought to revere. Was this simply superstition, or was there a deeper, spiritual truth to these claims? Were the monks truly trapped in an eternal cycle of suffering, their spirits unable to ascend because of the unnatural path they had chosen? Despite the eerie stories surrounding the mummies, the practice of self-mummification began to decline over time. Perhaps it was the physical toll on the monks themselves that led to the practice's eventual cessation, or perhaps it was the growing awareness of the dangers and spiritual risks associated with it. What had once been seen as a pure and holy act now seemed increasingly problematic, a dark pursuit of immortality that came with unforeseen consequences. Still, the mummified monks remain a mystery, objects of reverence, but also sources of dark fascination. Their bodies stand as a powerful testament to the lengths people will go in search of eternal life, but they also stand as a reminder of the cost of such pursuits. The monks sought to transcend death, but in doing so, they may have only found themselves bound to it, trapped forever in their preserved flesh, their souls caught between the realms of life and death. The curse of the mummified monks is not simply a story of spiritual devotion gone awry. It is a warning. It speaks of the dangers of seeking immortality at any cost, of disregarding the natural order of life and death, and of the consequences of pushing the human body to its very limits in the name of faith. In the end, the mummified monks remind us that the path to eternity is not one that can be easily navigated, and that even the most extreme acts of devotion come with a price. As the centuries passed, the legacy of the self-mummified monks began to take on an almost mythical quality. What had started as an act of extreme devotion to transcend the mortal realm had evolved into a story that blurred the lines between faith, madness, and spirituality. The monks who had chosen self-mummification were revered by some as paragons of spiritual purity, while others began to question whether their extreme devotion had led them to the edge of sanity. At the heart of this dilemma was the question, were the monks truly enlightened, or had their pursuit of eternal life driven them into madness? Their actions, though deeply rooted in religious beliefs, were extreme to the point of being unthinkable. They chose to starve themselves to death, not out of a desire to prove their faith in the traditional sense, but to transform their bodies into divine vessels. This obsession with purity through physical suffering raised questions about the mental state of those who undertook the ritual. From a psychological perspective, the monks' behavior could be seen as an attempt to exert complete control over their own bodies and destinies. In Buddhism, the idea of self-mastery is central. One must overcome desires and attachments to achieve nirvana. But the extreme methods employed by the monks suggest that their desire for transcendence may have gone beyond the rational, veering into a form of psychological extremism. By pushing their bodies to the point of death, they essentially rejected the natural course of life, trying to force their way into spiritual purity. In doing so, they might have been pursuing not enlightenment, but a spiritual obsession, a disordered attachment to the idea of immortality. The monks' mental and physical states, as they fasted for years, were often marked by delusions and hallucinations. In these final days, as their bodies broke down and their minds became increasingly detached from reality, they experienced visions, many of which were interpreted as spiritual revelations. But these visions, which were seen as divine messages, could also be viewed through a psychological lens as the hallucinations induced by extreme malnutrition and isolation. The monks, in their weakened state, may have been suffering from delirium or psychosis, brought on by prolonged starvation. The more they suffered, the more intense these visions became, leading them to believe they were in direct contact with Buddha or divine spirits. Some scholars have suggested that the extreme nature of the monks' actions was not just a quest for spirituality, but a form of mental escapism. Their bodies, ravaged by the hunger and isolation, became the ultimate symbols of a frenzied devotion to a spiritual ideal that may have bordered on madness. Could these monks have been attempting to escape the harsh realities of the physical world by severing themselves entirely from their own bodies? The fact that their quest for nirvana led them to a state of physical degradation and mental instability cast doubt on whether they ever truly found the peace they sought. There's also the question of how their actions were perceived by others in their communities. While many revered them as holy figures who had achieved the highest state of spiritual enlightenment, others likely saw them as suffering individuals who had gone too far in their pursuit of the divine. These monks' extreme sacrifices may have been viewed by some as an example of religious zealotry, an obsession with the afterlife that led them to disregard the inherent value of life itself. The practice of self-mummification, at its core, was a rejection of the natural process of death. The monks believed that by refusing food and enduring unbearable suffering, they could escape the normal human cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, ultimately achieving a state of spiritual purity. However, by choosing to force their bodies to decay while they were still alive, they essentially rejected the impermanence of life, the very concept that Buddhism teaches as fundamental to understanding reality. This rejection of the body's natural state and the relentless pursuit of an idealized immortality raises an unsettling question. Did the monks ever truly achieve enlightenment, or were they instead consumed by their obsession with a life beyond death? While the practice of self-mummification can be seen as the ultimate expression of faith, it also highlights the dangers of extreme devotion. In their pursuit of eternal life, the monks may have lost touch with the core Buddhist teaching of detachment from the physical world. Their obsession with transcending the physical body ultimately led them to make the body itself the focus of their spiritual quest, a contradiction in a faith that emphasizes the importance of letting go of attachments. The mummified monks remain a paradoxical legacy, one that speaks to the power and limits of human faith. Were they enlightened souls who achieved divine transcendence? Or were they tragic figures who, in their desperation to escape the cycle of death, sacrificed their humanity in the process? The truth, as always, is elusive, and their story leaves us with the haunting question of whether the path to immortality can truly be found through the sacrifice of life itself. Despite its initial spread and the devotion it inspired, the practice of self-mummification eventually began to fade away. The gradual decline of the ritual raises an intriguing question. Why did such an extreme and revered practice stop? What factors led to the abandonment of a centuries-old tradition that had once been a symbol of ultimate spiritual purity and devotion? At first, it seemed that the practice of self-mummification was unstoppable. The monks who chose this path were willing to endure unimaginable suffering in the name of nirvana, and the resulting mummified bodies became powerful symbols of sacrifice and spiritual ascension. However, as time wore on, the very extremity of the practice began to work against it. One key factor in the decline of self-mummification was the increasing recognition of its physical toll. As more monks attempted the process, it became clear that the physical costs were too great. The act of starving the body to death over the course of months or even years often resulted in permanent organ damage, severe psychological distress, and in many cases, premature death. The monks who survived the longest were often left in a state of near complete decay, with their bodies no longer able to function at all. The extreme nature of the ritual made it nearly impossible for the monks to complete it successfully, and many died before they could reach their spiritual goal. In some monastic orders, the moral and ethical questions surrounding the ritual began to surface. As more monks tried and failed to self-mummify, questions arose about whether this extreme self-sacrifice was truly aligned with Buddhist principles. The idea of renouncing the body in the pursuit of spiritual purity was central to Buddhist belief, but some began to wonder if self-mummification wasn't, in fact, a rejection of the natural cycle of life and death, an essential principle of Buddhist philosophy. The monks who attempted self-mummification were pushing themselves beyond the natural limits of the human body, perhaps in defiance of the very impermanence that Buddhism teaches as a universal truth. This philosophical tension eventually led to the reconsideration of the practice. While some continued to venerate the mummified monks and see them as holy relics, others began to see the practice as too extreme and too dangerous. As awareness grew about the physical and psychological toll on the monks, the practice began to be viewed not as a path to enlightenment, but as a dangerous obsession. Another factor that contributed to the decline was the increasing interference of government authorities. As the centuries passed, self-mummification became less acceptable to the ruling powers, who saw it as a disturbing practice that took valuable resources away from the monastic community. Monasteries were increasingly under scrutiny, and some were even forced to abandon or outlaw the practice in the interest of maintaining social order. The loss of patronage from the government and the rise of new forms of religious practice may have also played a role in the fading of self-mummification. As Buddhism evolved and reformed, more pragmatic and less extreme practices of achieving enlightenment gained popularity, rendering self-mummification obsolete. Moreover, as modernization began to take hold, there was a shift in how religious rituals were practiced. The rise of education, scientific inquiry, and a greater understanding of human biology led to a shift in attitudes about the body. The idea of forcibly altering the body in the name of religion began to seem more like a primitive superstition than a legitimate spiritual pursuit. The monks who had once sought transcendence through the sacrifice of their physical forms were increasingly seen as isolated figures, belonging to an older, more extreme version of faith. Cultural shifts also played a role. Over time, new forms of spiritual expression emerged within Buddhism, as well as other religious practices that did not require extreme acts of self-sacrifice. Meditation, mindfulness, and more practical forms of spiritual discipline began to replace the ritualized suffering that had once been seen as the ultimate expression of faith. As these more accessible practices gained ground, the need for the extreme rituals of self-mummification seemed increasingly outdated and unsustainable. In the end, self-mummification faded away not because of a single event, but due to a combination of factors: the physical toll, the ethical questions, the rise of new religious practices, and the growing influence of modernity. Yet, despite its decline, the legacy of the self-mummified monks persists to this day. The mummified remains that still exist continue to attract curiosity and reverence, standing as haunting symbols of a time when faith, suffering, and the human body were intertwined in the quest for divine transcendence. Even as the practice of self-mummification died out, the mummies themselves became eternal relics, cherished by some, feared by others, but forever standing as a reminder of the extreme limits of human devotion and the lengths some are willing to go to transcend death itself. As the practice of self-mummification faded into history, the mummified monks left behind more than just preserved bodies. Their legacy is one of spiritual paradox, a story of extreme devotion, suffering, and the complex interplay between faith, obsession, and mortality. These monks, who sacrificed their very flesh in pursuit of divine ascension, did not just leave behind physical remains. They left behind a profound question that still echoes today. Can the spiritual transcendence they sought ever truly be understood, or was it all merely a tragic misunderstanding of the human condition? The mummified monks stand today as living relics, not just of their time and their faith, but of an extreme idealism that no longer fits within the spiritual framework of modern Buddhism. While the practice of self-mummification is all but lost to the annals of history, the monks who underwent the ritual continue to haunt the temples, shrines, and caves where their bodies are preserved. These mummies are still venerated by some, and their stories are still told, passed down through generations as part of the mystical traditions of Buddhist lore. Yet, there's also a growing sense that the suffering and self-mortification of the monks may not have been the path to enlightenment they imagined. In modern interpretations of Buddhism, the idea of self-sacrifice through physical suffering has largely been replaced by more accessible practices, such as meditation and mindfulness. These practices emphasize mental clarity, compassion, and detachment from earthly desires, without the need for extreme physical acts. The monks who mummified themselves may have believed that suffering was the key to spiritual purity, but many modern Buddhists believe that true enlightenment is found through inner peace, not through the extreme pain and isolation that these monks endured. Despite this shift, the legacy of the self-mummified monks remains powerful. In many temples, their mummified remains still sit in glass cases or shrine rooms, surrounded by reverence and prayer. These bodies are treated as sacred artifacts, objects that represent the ultimate devotion and sacrifice that the monks gave for their faith. The mummified monks are sometimes displayed as symbols of the highest ideals of Buddhism, and people come from all over to pray before them, seeking blessings, spiritual guidance, or simply the opportunity to witness these living relics of a once extreme faith. The practice of self-mummification also raises important philosophical questions about the relationship between the body and the spirit in Buddhism. Was the monk's body simply a vessel for the soul, to be discarded in the pursuit of eternal life? Or did the monk's act of mummification represent the ultimate rejection of the material world, an attempt to transcend the human form entirely and achieve pure spiritual existence? The mummies remain enigmatic, their bodies stripped of life but preserved for eternity, a testament to a spiritual journey that still defies easy answers. The ethics of self-mummification, too, continues to be a subject of debate. While some regard the monks as saints, brave individuals who sought to go beyond the limits of the human body in their search for enlightenment, others question the morality of subjecting oneself to such extreme suffering. Was the practice an expression of deep faith, or was it a psychological obsession that led the monks to sacrifice their very humanity? The mummified monk's legacy forces us to consider whether extreme devotion to one's spiritual beliefs can ever be healthy, or whether it might lead to a dangerous detachment from reality. In the modern world, the mummies are not just objects of faith, but also cultural artifacts, symbols of an age-old practice that, while extreme, reflects the lengths to which people will go in search of meaning and purpose. The self-mummified monks serve as a reminder of human perseverance, of a desire to overcome death itself, and of the power of faith to push individuals to extremes. Their legacy also challenges us to reflect on our own relationships with the physical body, suffering, and death, questions that continue to be central to the human experience. The monks who self-mummified are no longer with us, but their spiritual legacy lives on in the stories told about them, in the temples that house their bodies, and in the teachings that continue to be passed down through the centuries. Whether seen as divine figures or tragic martyrs, they will always remain part of the mystical tapestry of Buddhist history, a haunting testament to the extreme devotion that can arise when the human spirit seeks to transcend the limits of the flesh. The enduring legacy of the self-mummified monks goes beyond their physical remains. Their story speaks to something far deeper, the human need for meaning, purpose, and the desire to transcend the limitations of the physical world. What drove so many people to follow these monks, to venerate their extreme acts of devotion, and to believe that their mummified bodies held divine power? The monks' practice was not just about self-sacrifice. It was about creating a path to eternal transcendence, one that would resonate across generations and inspire devotion from masses. The answer lies in the human desire to connect with something greater than oneself. These monks, by their extreme actions, offered a visible manifestation of faith. They weren't simply preaching about enlightenment. They were embodying it. The act of self-mummification turned the abstract concept of spiritual purity into something tangible. The physical bodies of the monks, preserved in their extreme state, became symbols of an uncompromising faith, one that was willing to push the very limits of human endurance in pursuit of the divine. For the faithful, the self-mummified monks were not just holy figures. They were beacons of hope. They were proof that it was possible to transcend the human condition, to rise above the limitations of the body and the mortal world. In a world marked by suffering and impermanence, these monks offered a glimpse into an existence beyond time, one where the soul was freed from the physical world. The belief that these monks had achieved this through their extreme suffering made their remains seem like portals to the divine, places where the faithful could come in direct contact with the ultimate truth. The faith of those who followed these monks was also rooted in ritualistic reverence. The act of venerating the mummified bodies was not merely about worshiping the monk's sacrifice. It was about honoring the journey the monks had taken, the journey that led them to spiritual perfection. In many ways, the mummified monks became a cultural anchor, a symbol of devotion and discipline that tied their followers to something far greater than themselves. Pilgrims visited the shrines, not only to see the mummies, but to experience the spiritual energy that surrounded them. The monks' bodies became a source of power, a tangible connection to the divine that was uniquely accessible. For many followers, the mummified monks were not just religious icons. They were spiritual guardians. People believed that by venerating their remains, they could receive blessings, protection, and guidance. In a world filled with uncertainty and hardship, the mummified monks stood as symbols of divine protection. Their sacrifice was seen as a shield against harm, and their preserved bodies were thought to carry the monks' spiritual energy. Just as the monks had suffered in isolation, their bodies now provided sanctuary for the living. The mummified remains became focal points for the faithful to seek spiritual comfort and relief from the trials of life. The deeply embedded belief that these monks had transcended death also played a crucial role in why people continued to follow them. The monks who self-mummified represented a pathway to immortality, not through physical resurrection, but through the eternal preservation of the soul. Their bodies were not seen as decayed relics, but as vessels that had been freed from the shackles of death. In following their path, the faithful believed that they, too, could transcend the limits of life, just as the monks had done. The act of self-mummification became a metaphor for spiritual liberation, and in veneration, followers believed they could achieve the same spiritual freedom. But beyond the belief in divine power, the monks' extreme devotion also tapped into a more human aspect of religion, the need to belong to something larger than oneself. In following these monks, people became part of a shared tradition, a community of faith that extended across generations. The monks' extreme acts of self-mortification, their sacrifices, were not seen as something alien or bizarre, but as part of a larger, collective story of human aspiration, a desire to rise above the suffering of the world and achieve divine peace. Despite the controversy surrounding the practice, the monks' actions inspired a lasting faith in the possibility of transcendence. Their mummified bodies became symbols of the lengths one could go to in search of salvation. And for the faithful, these monks offered a concrete expression of the abstract ideals of Buddhism. The path they walked, one of extreme suffering, isolation, and ultimate sacrifice, became a blueprint for those who sought a more intense connection with the divine. Today, the legacy of the self-mummified monks continues to inspire fascination and respect, with their preserved bodies still being objects of religious devotion and historical curiosity. While the extreme nature of their path may seem unthinkable to many, their devotion stands as a testament to the power of belief and the human desire to transcend the physical world in search of something greater. Their story reminds us of the profound lengths to which some will go to achieve spiritual fulfillment and the lasting influence of the human pursuit of immortality. The practice of self-mummification, while deeply entrenched in spiritual and cultural beliefs, has also piqued the curiosity of the scientific community. As mummified monks continue to captivate both religious followers and researchers, questions about how such a feat could be possible have led to a scientific exploration of practice. While the monks' intentions were primarily spiritual, modern science has begun to uncover the physical realities of self-mummification, and in doing so, has opened up new avenues for understanding both the human body and the boundaries of human endurance. One of the most critical aspects of self-mummification is the dehydration of the body. The process of self-mummification often begins with a dietary restriction that aims to rid the body of excess fat and fluid, starting a gradual dehydration process. The monks, by fasting for months or years, were effectively draining the moisture from their bodies, moisture that would normally facilitate the decay process. This method of preserving the body by starving and dehydrating it parallels modern preservation techniques used to create mummies in ancient Egypt and other cultures. The starvation process is not just about depriving the body of food. It's also about metabolic changes that slow the process of decomposition. When the body goes into a state of starvation, it enters a kind of survival mode, conserving energy and breaking down fat reserves for fuel. This gradual breakdown of the body's fat, while harmful in the short term, is a key component in mummification. The fat is consumed by the body, and in doing so, it effectively limits the nutrients that bacteria and fungi need to carry out the decomposition process. Along with starvation, the monks often used herbal and medicinal treatments to help preserve their bodies. Some monks applied substances such as resins, salts, and herbs to their skin in an effort to keep it from decaying after death. These substances likely played an important role in slowing the decomposition of the monks' remains. Modern science has shown that some natural resins and salts, such as turpentine or pine resin, have antibacterial properties that would help preserve tissues by preventing the growth of microorganisms responsible for decay. This practice of external preservation, combined with internal dehydration, allowed the monks' bodies to survive in a preserved state long after their deaths. But what about the extreme physical suffering? The idea that a body can survive extreme deprivation for an extended period challenges our conventional understanding of the human body. The human body has limits, and while self-mummification required the monks to push their bodies to the brink of collapse, the fact that some monks were able to endure this process suggests that the human body is capable of remarkable resilience. Scientific studies on extreme fasting and starvation have shown that the body can survive without food for extended periods under certain conditions, especially if water intake is managed. However, the monks did not survive without consequences. Many died before completing the process, and those who succeeded had bodies ravaged by years of deprivation. Interestingly, the role of psychological factors also cannot be dismissed. Research into extreme fasting and religious asceticism shows that the mind-body connection plays a crucial role in enduring prolonged physical suffering. The monks' mental focus on their spiritual goals likely helped them tolerate the immense pain and deprivation they experienced. It is possible that the monks were able to endure starvation in ways that would be impossible for the average person due to their intense spiritual commitment. This level of mental determination, combined with physiological changes, might explain how some were able to achieve the mummified state. However, the process was not without its dangers. Medical research has shown that extreme starvation can lead to organ failure, cardiac arrest, and irreversible damage to the body systems. While the monks believed they were purifying their bodies, science tells us that their extreme actions likely led to severe physical damage. In many cases, the monks who attempted self-mummification did not survive the process, their bodies succumbing to the effects of starvation-induced organ failure. Even for those who did survive, their bodies were severely compromised, and the preservation of the body often required extensive care and modification after death. In addition to the physical process of mummification, modern science has also helped researchers understand how the monks' preserved bodies withstood the passage of time. Many of the mummified monks were discovered centuries after their deaths, still remarkably intact. This preservation was largely due to the combination of dehydration, environmental conditions, and the preservative substances used. The specific climate in which the monks lived also played a role. The dry, cold environments of the mountain temples acted as natural refrigerators, slowing the natural process of decay. While the scientific community has debunked some of the mystical claims about the monks' bodies, such as reports of miraculous movement or supernatural phenomena, there is no denying that their mummified remains hold a certain aura of mystery. Their preservation was not purely due to natural processes, but also the result of deliberate human action. The monks' bodies stand as a physical testament to the lengths some will go in the name of faith and the extremes of human endurance. Today, the mummified monks continue to serve as both spiritual relics and scientific curiosities, offering a unique blend of religious devotion and human resilience. As we continue to study their bodies and the methods they use to achieve mummification, we learn not only about their spiritual beliefs, but also about the human body's ability to endure and survive extreme conditions. The monks' bodies may have been preserved in death, but their legacy continues to haunt and inspire both the faithful and the curious alike. The practice of self-mummification was not confined to any one culture or religious belief system. While the most well-known examples of self-mummified monks come from Buddhist traditions in Japan, similar practices can be found in other parts of the world. The idea of self-sacrifice for spiritual transcendence, though extreme, transcended cultural boundaries and religious doctrines. Across cultures, people have sought to achieve spiritual purification and immortality through the extreme suffering of their bodies, often at the cost of their own lives. In many ways, the monks who practiced self-mummification were part of a long human tradition that sought to overcome the natural limitations of the physical body. This tradition spans not only Buddhism, but also Christianity, Islam, and other faiths where fasting, asceticism, and extreme devotion are seen as paths to spiritual enlightenment or salvation. In Christian mysticism, ascetics like Saint Simeon Stylites, who lived atop a pillar for 37 years, demonstrated an intense form of bodily denial. His actions, much like those of the Buddhist monks, were motivated by a desire to transcend earthly pleasures and dedicate the body entirely to God's will. Similarly, in Islam, the practice of Sufism involves ascetic practices, such as fasting and denial of worldly comforts, to achieve a closer connection with the divine. Across these faiths, extreme self-sacrifice was often seen as a holy act, one that proved the devotees' deep faith and commitment to their spiritual beliefs. Whether through fasting, solitary meditation, or extreme physical endurance, these individuals believed that they could achieve a higher spiritual state, one that was not attainable through ordinary means. In this way, the act of self-mummification was not simply an isolated practice, but part of a global spiritual tradition that sought to reconcile the body and soul and to transcend the limitations of human existence. The key difference between these practices, however, lay in the spiritual goals and philosophies of the respective religions. In Buddhism, the monks who self-mummified were renouncing their attachments to the physical world, seeking to rid themselves of all desires in pursuit of nirvana. The extreme sacrifice of the body was seen as the ultimate purification, allowing the monks to transcend the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. In contrast, Christian ascetics like Simeon Stylites did not aim to transcend their physical bodies in the same way. Rather, their bodily suffering was meant to purify the soul and show devotion to God, but did not involve the idea of escaping the human experience altogether. Islamic mystics, or Sufis, also practiced extreme devotion and bodily denial, but their focus was on spiritual closeness to God rather than the destruction of the body. Fasting, which is common across many faiths, was used to purify the soul and show submission to divine will. However, the goal was not to literally destroy the body through starvation or other forms of extreme suffering. The aim was to purify the soul through disciplined restraint and self-control, not to achieve an eternal physical state. The practice of self-mummification, then, is both a reflection of universal human devotion and an expression of a unique cultural interpretation of the relationship between body and soul. While the Buddhist monks saw their bodies as temporary vessels that had to be discarded to achieve spiritual purity, other religious practices focused on preserving the body as a sacred tool for the soul's journey. The monks' extreme acts were reflective of their belief that the body was an obstacle to spiritual transcendence, while in other faiths, the body was viewed as an integral part of spiritual development. Despite these differences, what unites all these practices is a common belief in spiritual ascension and a human desire to overcome the limitations of the earthly experience. In this sense, self-mummification was not just a Buddhist phenomenon, but part of a much larger tradition of sacrifice and devotion across cultures. The monks who chose to self-mummify were not isolated in their beliefs. They were part of a broader human quest to achieve something greater than the physical world. While self-mummification may have declined in popularity over time, the spiritual and cultural ideas it embodies continue to resonate in various forms across different religions. The practice remains a powerful symbol of ultimate devotion and the pursuit of divine transcendence, regardless of the religion or culture in which it is practiced. The monks who chose to undergo this extreme form of devotion and the legacies they left behind continue to inspire questions about the human condition, our relationship with the body, the nature of spiritual purity, and the lengths to which we will go to transcend death itself. Though the practice of self-mummification largely disappeared over the centuries, it has not been completely erased from the spiritual landscape. In certain parts of the world, particularly in remote Buddhist communities, the tradition of preserving the body after death still carries symbolic weight, even if the extreme rituals associated with self-mummification have been abandoned. Today, some monks and devotees continue to follow practices that echo the ancient path of self-sacrifice, albeit in less physically taxing forms. In Japan, where the self-mummification ritual was most famously practiced, some Buddhist monks still undergo the long process of asceticism, although without the extreme starvation that once characterized it. Modern ascetics may adopt rigorous fasting or meditative practices, but these acts are generally seen as ways to purify the mind and body, rather than a prelude to the kind of extreme self-destruction that once led to mummification. Instead of self-mummification, the focus is now on spiritual purity through more sustainable practices, such as meditation, monastic living, and the cultivation of mindfulness. However, there are still monks in some remote parts of Japan, particularly in the Udono Mountains, who believe that the spiritual power of self-mummification still holds meaning today. These monks often honor the practice by preserving the bodies of deceased monks in the traditional mummification process, not through starvation, but through modern methods of embalming. While the ritual fasting of self-mummification is no longer practiced, some still perform ceremonial remembrance rituals for those monks who underwent the process centuries ago, viewing their preserved bodies as a way to maintain a spiritual connection to the past. Beyond Japan, other Buddhist traditions, such as those found in Tibet and Thailand, also continue to venerate mummified remains of revered monks, though these bodies are typically preserved after death by embalming rather than through starvation. In these places, the practice of mummification still holds deep religious significance. The bodies of holy figures, some of whom are believed to have achieved extraordinary levels of spiritual purity, are enshrined in temples and shrines as sacred relics. These mummies serve as symbols of the monk's transcendence over the physical body and as sources of spiritual guidance for the living. Interestingly, the concept of mummification as spiritual purity has also been adapted in certain New Age religious practices. In some modern-day cults and spiritual movements, there's a renewed interest in achieving immortality or eternal life, with some followers believing that the preservation of the body through modern methods, such as cryonics, freezing the body after death, could be the key to spiritual transcendence. While this has little to do with the ancient practice of self-mummification, it reflects a contemporary fascination with the idea of cheating death and preserving the human form as a means to access a higher plane of existence. This modern interpretation of preserving the body is not without controversy. The idea of freezing human bodies in hopes of future revival is considered by many to be both morally questionable and scientifically unproven. However, it draws on the same fundamental human desire that inspired the monks to mummify their bodies centuries ago, the desire for immortality and the wish to transcend death. Whether through self-mummification, cryonics, or other forms of bodily preservation, these modern-day practices are a testament to the unyielding human quest to conquer death. While the ritual of self-mummification itself may no longer be practiced in the extreme form it once was, its spiritual influence persists. The mummified monks who once stood as symbols of devotion and sacrifice still resonate deeply within Buddhist traditions, and their bodies remain a powerful reminder of the lengths people will go to in search of eternal life. In the end, the practice of self-mummification was not just a religious act. It was a cultural statement, a challenge to the human condition, and an attempt to break free from the limitations of the physical world. Today, its legacy endures, not just in the mummified bodies that are still displayed in shrines, but in the continued spiritual search for transcendence, whether through asceticism, meditation, or even the preservation of the body in hopes of one day escaping death. The mummified monks are no longer with us, but their story, their legacy, and their profound dedication to their beliefs live on in the modern world, reshaping the way we think about life, death, and the eternal. The mummified monks, whose bodies have survived for centuries, serve as more than just historical curiosities or religious relics. They stand as powerful symbols of the human quest for meaning, spiritual transcendence, and the extremes to which people will go in pursuit of a higher power. But beyond their spiritual significance, the story of the self-mummified monks also offers valuable lessons about the dangers of obsession and the limits of devotion. First and foremost, the monk's story highlights the cost of extreme belief. Their pursuit of immortality through self-sacrifice was not a simple act of devotion. It was a life-altering decision that led them to inflict immense physical suffering upon themselves. In their attempt to conquer death, they ultimately pushed their bodies past the point of no return. Their journey raises important questions about the fine line between spiritual purity and self-destruction. The monks believed they were transcending the physical world, but in doing so, they sacrificed their bodies, and perhaps their humanity, along the way. The extreme nature of self-mummification also points to the human tendency to seek meaning through suffering. It's a theme that has appeared in many religious and spiritual traditions throughout history. The idea that by enduring suffering or pain, one can achieve spiritual enlightenment or closeness to the divine. However, the mummified monks challenge us to question whether such extreme suffering is truly necessary, or if it's a reflection of a deeper psychological need. The moral cost of the monks' devotion is clear. They gave up their lives, their health, and their very humanity in the belief that this would lead to spiritual enlightenment. But the question remains, was their suffering justified by the ultimate spiritual payoff, or were they simply victims of a misguided obsession with immortality? One of the most significant lessons we can take from the story of the self-mummified monks is the importance of balance in the pursuit of spiritual growth. While self-sacrifice and devotion to one's faith are admirable, the monk's story serves as a warning about the dangers of extremism. In their intense pursuit of spiritual purity, the monks may have lost sight of the core teachings of their faith, the impermanence of life, the acceptance of death, and the transcendence of the physical body. Their extreme actions serve as a reminder that spiritual growth should not come at the cost of one's physical well-being or one's ability to live a balanced, healthy life. In modern times, the story of the self-mummified monks can serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing extreme forms of devotion without considering the broader consequences. Whether in religion, personal goals, or other areas of life, an obsession with a singular outcome can often blind us to the bigger picture. The monks were so focused on transcending the physical world that they may have neglected the importance of living fully in the present moment, of embracing the natural rhythms of life and death rather than rejecting them. Furthermore, the monk's story challenges us to reconsider the concept of immortality. While the idea of eternal life has fascinated humanity for millennia, the self-mummified monks' bodies, preserved for centuries, serve as reminders of the limits of the physical form. No matter how perfectly preserved, the body will eventually decay. The monks' mummified remains may have survived, but they are far from the immortal figures they had hoped to become. Their story forces us to confront the reality that immortality, whether achieved through physical preservation or spiritual means, may be an unattainable ideal. The spiritual immortality they sought may have been more of a metaphysical pursuit, not one that can be found through the preservation of the physical body. Lastly, the monks' mummified remains continue to inspire contemplation on the relationship between the body and the soul. While many religious traditions stress the importance of transcending the body to reach higher spiritual states, the monk's story raises important questions about how we view the physical form. The body, after all, is the vessel through which we experience life. Should it be discarded or revered? Is it possible to honor the body while seeking spiritual enlightenment? Or does the pursuit of the divine require the rejection of the body's needs? Ultimately, the mummified monks remain a powerful testament to faith and sacrifice, but their story is also a reminder of the dangers of extremism. Their sacrifice, though extreme, was a manifestation of their unwavering belief in spiritual ascension. The question remains, was their path truly the right one, or was it a misguided quest to transcend the limits of the body? The mummified monks challenge us to think critically about the nature of faith, the role of the body in spiritual practice, and the ultimate pursuit of immortality. The self-mummified monks, with their bodies preserved through extreme devotion, have transcended the bounds of ordinary religious history. Their practice, once so widespread and fervently believed to lead to spiritual purity, now exists as an enigma, an unanswered question that continues to stir both awe and unease. While their physical remains are kept in sacred shrines, the stories surrounding their extreme devotion are retold as legends, filled with both reverence and cautionary wisdom. The monk's journey from life to death, from suffering to transcendence, mirrors a human longing that stretches beyond the walls of religion. Their quest for immortality, for eternal spiritual purity, resonates with the broader human desire to overcome mortality. In their extreme acts, they sought something greater than themselves. But in the years since, as the practice of self-mummification has dwindled, the mummified monks have become symbols not just of spiritual devotion, but of the complex intersection between faith and flesh, sacrifice and survival. In the legends that still surround them, the monks are both venerated and questioned. They remain icons of devotion, held up as examples of unwavering faith and commitment to the divine. But the cost of their devotion, the extreme nature of their actions, gives rise to doubt and reflection. Were they truly the embodiment of spiritual enlightenment, or were they victims of their own obsession with transcending the physical? The monks live on not just as preserved relics, but as symbols of both spiritual purity and human folly, representing the delicate balance between transcendence and self-destruction. In Buddhist traditions, the mummified remains of these monks are still seen as holy relics, visited by pilgrims seeking guidance, healing, and protection. Their bodies are honored for the ultimate sacrifice they made in pursuit of the divine. Yet, their continued reverence also speaks to a spiritual paradox. The more extreme the sacrifice, the greater the spiritual reward. The monks gave their bodies, but they also gave their lives in the pursuit of enlightenment, and their mummified bodies became physical testaments to their faith. Despite the fading of the ritual, the monks' legacy persists, woven into the fabric of Buddhist culture and beyond. They are not just relics of the past. They are living legends that continue to provoke thought, debate, and curiosity. The practice of self-mummification may have died, but its legacy lives on in the mystery of the monk's sacrifice and the haunting reminder of the extreme lengths to which some will go in search of a higher spiritual existence. The monk's story also leaves us with questions that continue to challenge our understanding of faith and sacrifice. Was their path truly the right one? Or were they consumed by an obsession with immortality? Did they achieve the nirvana they sought? Or did they lose their humanity in the process? Their story is a reminder that extreme devotion, while noble, can also lead to dangerous consequences. In the modern world, the self-mummified monks remain a powerful symbol of the human spirit's quest for transcendence. But their legacy also serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of obsession. Their mummified bodies are not just objects of reverence. They are living lessons, reminding us of the fragility of the human body, the complexity of spiritual beliefs, and the danger of pushing the human form beyond its natural boundaries. Though the monks' mummification practice is largely lost to history, their spiritual quest continues to resonate. Their preserved bodies stand as a testament to faith, a faith that transcends death itself. And as long as their mummified remains are preserved and their stories told, they will live on as legends that challenge us to think about the limits of human devotion and the cost of immortality. Their story is not simply one of sacrifice, but of the extremes we are willing to endure in the pursuit of something greater than ourselves. As long as their bodies remain intact, as long as people continue to revere them, the monk's legend will live on, forever enshrined in the annals of history, a reminder that in our search for transcendence, we may come face to face with the ultimate question: what is the price of eternity?